The year is 1242. Imagine this moment frozen in time. You're standing on a lake of ice so thick it could support armies, yet so treacherous that one crack could swallow thousands. The April wind cuts through your armor like daggers made of winter itself. Your scouts have returned with news that makes veteran warriors go pale. Not 60,000 enemies as intelligence suggested. 80,000 of the Golden Horde's most fearsome warriors, stretching across the frozen horizon like an endless tide of death. That's 267 enemies for every one of your brothers. The arithmetic of extinction is simple, absolute, and undeniable. Yet in 4 hours, 40,000 of those warriors will lie dead or dying. The most terrifying Mongol force assembled since Genghis Khan himself will be shattered. A 42-year-old prince with a shattered jaw and missing eye will accomplish what military experts declared impossible. What the laws of war said could never happen. What even the saints seem to have abandoned. Consider those numbers one more time. 300 armored knights against 80,000 Mongol horsemen. The fate of Orthodox Christianity, perhaps all of Eastern Europe, balanced on ice so thin that breathing too hard might crack it. By nightfall, that ice will be painted red for miles. History will record it as the battle that saved Europe from the Mongol tsunami. Before we dive into this impossible victory, understand that what I'm about to tell you defies everything you think you know about medieval warfare. The accepted rules, the conventional wisdom, the tactical doctrines written in blood over centuries. All of it will be shattered by the events of April 5th, 1242. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will transform your understanding of medieval warfare forever. First, the catastrophic tactical error Batu Khan made that military scholars still debate. Second, why Mongol warriors who'd conquered from China to Poland fled screaming across frozen water. Third, the moment when Alexander Nevsky, a prince whose face had been shattered by a Teutonic mace, raised a war cry that echoed across Lake Peipus and changed the course of Western civilization. Alexander Nevsky wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a battlefield, much less commanding an army against impossible odds. The injuries he'd sustained fighting German crusaders just months earlier should have left him crippled for life, confined to a monastery cell with monks praying over his broken body. A Teutonic knight's mace had caught him full in the face during the battle on the ice against the German knights in April 1242, shattering his jaw in 3 places, destroying his left eye completely, crushing the orbital bone, and leaving him unable to speak clearly for weeks. The blow should have killed him instantly. The fact that he survived at all was considered miraculous by the physicians who treated him. Court physicians had recommended he retire to a monastery to live out his remaining days in prayer and contemplation, to make peace with God and await death. Every step caused pain that radiated through his skull like lightning striking repeatedly. Every word he spoke reminded him of broken bones that hadn't healed properly, that would never heal properly, that ground against each other with every movement. Yet here he stood, commanding an army against odds that made his German victories look like minor skirmishes, like practice for children. His younger officers whispered that the pain had driven him mad, that the constant agony had snapped something in his mind. His older advisors feared the head wound had affected his judgment, that brain damage was causing delusions of grandeur. But Alexander knew something they didn't, something he couldn't explain in words. Sometimes madness and genius look identical. Sometimes the line between divine inspiration and insanity is invisible. Sometimes God speaks through pain. Facing him was Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, the man who'd made Europe tremble and Asia bow before Mongol might. At 35, he commanded the Golden Horde, an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, an empire so vast that messengers took months to cross it. His armies had burned hundreds of cities to ash and scattered their populations to the winds like leaves in autumn. His horsemen had drunk from the Volga to the Danube, leaving a trail of devastation that cartographers struggled to map, because entire cities had ceased to exist. Entire kingdoms had been erased from maps at his command. His reputation was so terrifying that some cities surrendered when his scouts merely appeared on the horizon, when the dust of his armies could be seen days away. There were tales of garrison commanders committing suicide rather than face Batu's wrath, rather than endure the tortures the Mongols inflicted on those who resisted. While Alexander nursed his shattered face in Novgorod, barely able to eat solid food, consuming only liquids and mush through his broken jaw, Batu commanded over 200,000 warriors across his vast domains, warriors who'd proven themselves in combat from the steppes of Mongolia to the forests of Poland. The comparison wasn't just unequal, it was laughable. It was offensive to even suggest they belonged in the same sentence. It was like comparing a wounded dog to a pride of lions. Novgorod itself was preparing for annihilation, for the end of everything. Monasteries were evacuating their most sacred relics, including pieces of the true cross and the bones of saints that had been preserved for centuries. Wealthy merchants had already fled north toward Finland, taking their gold and leaving the poor to face the Mongol storm, abandoning the city to its fate. Secret envoys were attempting to negotiate terms of tribute that might spare the city from total destruction, though they had little hope of success. The wise said Rus had weeks at most. The optimists said months. The realists said days. The total forces Alexander could muster from all of Novgorod's territories, even pulling in every able-bodied man who could hold a weapon, every farmer who could swing an axe, every merchant who could lift a sword, perhaps 5,000 men scattered across frozen wastelands the size of Western Europe. Batu's current force alone, this army of 80,000, was 16 times everything the Russians could theoretically field if given months to gather their strength from every corner of the realm. And this wasn't even the Horde's full strength. This was just the western wing of their invasion force. The full strength of the Golden Horde numbered over 200,000 warriors, the largest army the world had seen since Alexander the Great. Here's the brutal reality that April morning. Alexander could gather only 300 mounted knights, including barely 50 druzhina, elite warriors who'd sworn blood oaths to die for their prince, and who wore armor passed down through 3 generations. Supporting them were roughly 2,000 infantry, mostly peasant levies who'd never seen real combat, armed with spears, axes, and desperate faith in Orthodox Christianity. Many of these men had never been more than 20 miles from their villages. Against them, Batu had brought 30,000 heavy cavalry, Mongol warriors who could fire arrows while riding at full gallop, who'd conquered the largest empire in human history, who'd defeated Chinese war machines and Persian heavy cavalry with equal ease. Another 50,000 light cavalry supported them, raiders who could cover 100 miles in a day and fight at the end of it. These weren't conscripts or levies. These were professional soldiers who'd been trained from childhood. Mongol boys learned to ride before they could walk, learned to shoot before they could read. By the time they reached fighting age, they were weapons as much as warriors. But as winter gave way reluctantly to spring in 1242, intelligence reached Novgorod that forced the wounded prince to attempt the unthinkable. A merchant traveling from the south, half dead from the journey, brought news that made Alexander's blood run cold. Batu wasn't just raiding. He was coming to finish what the Mongols had started a generation ago. The complete conquest of Rus, the final extinction of Orthodox resistance, the end of everything. Inside the fortress of Pskov, recently liberated from Teutonic occupation at terrible cost, the war council had descended into chaos. Alexander, his face still bandaged, his destroyed eye covered with a leather patch that wept continuously, sat at the head of a table carved from ancient oak. The April cold that should have been retreating instead seemed to deepen, as if nature itself sensed the coming storm. The stone walls of the fortress, built to withstand German sieges, seemed thin as parchment against what was coming. Every man in that chamber knew what the scouts had reported. Batu's 80,000 were moving north along the frozen waterways, following the ancient trade routes that connected Asia to Europe, heading directly for Novgorod. The city's walls, impressive against human armies, meant nothing to Mongol siege engineers who'd breached Chinese fortifications built over centuries. The numbers were extinction, not defeat, not occupation, extinction. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they erased. Cities that resisted ceased to exist. Populations that fought were slaughtered to the last child. Batu had perfected the art of annihilation. Andrei of Suzdal, Alexander's younger brother and second in command, a man who'd fought beside him in a dozen battles, spoke what everyone was thinking, his voice cracked with emotion. "Brother, we must retreat north, gather our people, flee to Sweden if necessary. Better alive in exile than dead heroes in a frozen grave. We can rebuild. We can return, but only if we survive." Others murmured agreement, their faces pale with terror. Vsevolod, an old warrior who'd fought the Mongols before and barely survived, suggested they might buy time with tribute: gold, silver, furs, slaves, anything to delay the inevitable. Even the grizzled Druzhina commander Ratmir, who'd fought beside Alexander's father, Alexander Yaroslavich, who'd seen more battles than he could count, stayed silent. The situation was beyond desperate. It was hopeless. Every military principle, every tactical consideration, every historical precedent said to run. To fight was to die. It was that simple. Then Alexander did something that stunned even his most loyal warriors. Despite a jaw that still shifted when he moved too quickly, sending waves of agony through his skull, despite an eye socket that wept continuously from cold, leaking fluid that froze on his cheek, he stood. His remaining good eye swept across every face in that stone chamber. When he spoke, his words were slurred from his injury, barely comprehensible, but the conviction was unmistakable. The force of his will filled the room like a physical presence. "Gentlemen, I did not survive German steel to bow before Mongol arrows. God spared my life at the Neva for a reason. When we achieve victory, and we will achieve victory, no man can claim it was Russian strength alone. This will be God's victory. We are merely His instruments. The room erupted in protest. Victory against 80,000. Had his head wound affected his mind? Had the constant pain driven him insane? Several knights began arguing openly. This wasn't courage. It was suicide. It was murder of their men. It was the end of everything they'd fought to preserve. But Ratmir, the old warrior, was the first to understand. His Druzhina had sworn blood oaths. If a prince with half a face could choose death over dishonor, how could they choose otherwise? One by one, the warriors began beating their fists against their chests, the ancient Rus signal of absolute commitment. Not in submission, but in something far more powerful, belief. Belief that sometimes God requires the impossible. Belief that sometimes faith matters more than arithmetic. Belief that this scarred, broken prince saw something they couldn't see. What happened next violated every principle of military wisdom accumulated over centuries of warfare. Instead of fortifying Novgorod's defenses, instead of preparing for a siege, Alexander ordered an immediate march, not toward safety, but directly toward the Mongol host. The army would depart before dawn, taking every man who could wield a weapon. They would leave the city defenseless. They would march towards certain death. The insanity of the plan was breathtaking. It took everyone's breath away. March undermanned forces 60 miles across frozen wilderness to engage an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 300 to 1. Not defend, not delay, attack. The word attack seemed obscene given the circumstances. Here's what military historians still can't explain. The march that followed should have killed a third of his force before ever seeing the enemy. 60 miles in 48 hours across ice, snow, and frozen marsh. Men in armor designed for Baltic warfare, not Asian steppes. Heavy mail and plate designed to stop German lances, too cumbersome for rapid movement. Horses struggled on ice that could barely support their weight. The April nights, still brutal with winter's last gasp, froze sentries to death at their posts. Men began collapsing after the first day. By the second day, frostbite was claiming fingers and toes. Soldiers were literally leaving pieces of themselves along the trail. Alexander himself, his face wounds reopened by the cold, left a trail of frozen blood drops in the snow. At one point, near the village of Kobila, witnesses saw the prince collapse, unconscious, his shattered jaw having locked from the cold. His face had turned blue. His breathing had stopped. Yet when his Druzhina revived him with hot mead, forcing the liquid past his locked jaw, his first words were always the same. Continue the march. His officers begged him to rest. His brother Andrei pleaded with him to show mercy to the men. But Alexander drove them forward with relentless determination. He seemed possessed by something beyond human endurance. Meanwhile, Batu Khan had made the catastrophic decision that would cost him everything. Supremely confident in his overwhelming superiority, having never lost a major engagement in his entire military career, he'd allowed his massive army to spread across 5 miles of frozen Lake Peipus. The ice was thick, nearly 3 feet in places. It could support thousands of horses. His engineers had tested it. His shamans had blessed it. His scouts had reported Novgorod's forces scattered and demoralized. Why maintain tight formation when marching to collect tribute from terrified cities? Why waste energy on military discipline when the enemy had already given up? His commanders were already arguing over which Russian territories each would govern, dividing up lands they hadn't yet conquered. The Khan himself had brought his entire command staff, his advisors, his Persian chroniclers, to record the triumph, planning not a battle but a coronation. He would crown himself Khan of all Rus in the ruins of Novgorod. By dawn on April 5th, Alexander's impossible march had covered ground that maps said couldn't be crossed in that time. His men were more dead than alive, held in their saddles by willpower alone. But they had arrived. Scouts brought electrifying news. Batu's army wasn't in battle formation. They were spread across the frozen lake, relaxed, unprepared, their horses tethered in loose groups. Supply wagons were separated from fighting units. The Mongol cavalry was dispersed across miles of ice, individual tumans acting independently. God had delivered them exactly as Alexander had prophesied. The prince, hearing this, smiled for the first time since the march began. His broken face made the smile horrifying, but his eye blazed with triumph. April 5th, 1242, dawned clear and cold, and Batu Khan's scouts had made an error that would cost 40,000 lives. The morning at 7 brought the first gift from God, or perhaps from Alexander's tactical genius, or perhaps from both working in concert. The prince's scouts, local hunters who knew Lake Peipus like they knew their own heartbeats, men who'd fished these waters since childhood, returned with news that made even frost-bitten knights straighten in their saddles. Batu's mighty host wasn't arranged for combat. They were scattered across the frozen lake in a pattern that suggested supreme confidence bordering on arrogance. Supply wagons separated from cavalry units, horse lines dispersed in a pattern that suggested an army at rest, not at war. The Mongol force looked less like the terror of Asia and more like merchants at a winter fair, relaxed and confident. Ratmir rode to Alexander's position. "My prince, God has delivered them into our hands." But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice when he added the next part. "The numbers are worse than we feared. Not 60,000 as the merchant reported, not 70,000 as we hoped, at least 80,000. Their banners blacken the ice from shore to shore. I've never seen an army so vast. Some warriors openly wept at this news. Others fell to their knees in the snow, praying to Orthodox saints for intercession, to St. George the Warrior, to St. Michael the Archangel, to the Virgin Mary herself. 267 to 1. The mathematics had become even more impossible. It was beyond impossible. It was apocalyptic. At 10 a.m., Batu received his first warning. Movement on the western shore, ice clouds rising from horse hooves. His initial reaction, recorded faithfully by Persian chroniclers traveling with the horde to document the conquest, was complete dismissal. His scouts had confirmed Novgorod's forces were scattered and terrified. Alexander Nevsky was reportedly dying from his German wounds, bedridden and delirious. It had to be refugees, perhaps desperate civilians hoping to flee before the Mongols arrived. Perhaps a merchant caravan that hadn't heard the war news. He sent orders for a single tumen, 10,000 men, to investigate and capture them for intelligence. Nothing more. This arrogance would haunt him forever. It would haunt his entire lineage. By noon, the terrible truth became undeniable. Russian banners appeared on the ice, approaching at speed. Not refugee flags, but war standards. The golden sunburst of Novgorod streaming in the wind. The Orthodox crosses of Pskov. still bearing bloodstains from the German wars. The personal banner of Alexander Nevsky himself, a silver wolf on black field, the same banner that had flown at the Neva. Batu's scattered forces began desperately trying to form their traditional formations, the complex cavalry arrangements that had conquered half the known world. But 5 miles is an eternity when your enemy is already formed and moving. Commands in Mongolian, Turkish, and Chinese clashed as officers tried to organize the chaos. Messengers galloped in every direction. Horns blew contradictory signals. The perfect Mongol military machine was stuttering. Here's where legend meets reality, where history becomes myth, where the impossible becomes documented fact. Military logic demanded Alexander wait. Let Batu organize his forces, then retreat to the shoreline. Force them to attack prepared positions, use the terrain. Every manual of steppe warfare, every precedent from Mongol conquests, every tactical principle developed over centuries said the same thing. Never charge a numerically superior force. Never attack when outnumbered. Never stake everything on a single moment. Alexander was about to violate every one of these rules. He was about to do something so insane that chroniclers on both sides would question whether they'd witnessed it correctly. Despite agony that would have felled most men, that should have killed him. The wounded prince demanded to mount his warhorse. Warriors rushed to help him, his equilibrium still damaged from his head wound. He couldn't mount unassisted. Blood had already soaked through his facial bandages where the cold had cracked his wounds open. His destroyed eye socket was leaking fluid that instantly froze. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire Russian line. His words were slurred but powerful. Brothers, David killed Goliath with faith and a stone. We face 80,000 with God and ice. We are the stone. God is the hand that throws us. The ice is Goliath's weakness. Today we write history that men will speak of for 1,000 years. The Mongol army's reaction tells us everything about their shock. Elite horsemen, warriors who'd faced Chinese war elephants and Persian heavy cavalry without flinching. Men who'd ridden from one end of Asia to the other, leaving only devastation behind, simply stared. For precious seconds, they couldn't process what they were seeing. 300 knights forming a wedge formation against 80,000 wasn't warfare. It was suicide. It was madness. It was impossible. Batu himself, watching from his command position on the eastern shore, threw his ceremonial helmet to the ice. The grandson of Genghis Khan couldn't comprehend the insanity unfolding before him. He'd seen desperate last stands before. He'd crushed them all. But he'd never seen an army charge toward annihilation. Armies retreated. They defended. They ran. They never attacked. Then Alexander noticed something Batu had missed in his confidence, something the Mongol Khan's experience had made him overlook. The lake ice, while thick enough to support armies, while solid enough to seem safe, was weakest along specific channels where underground springs fed warm water. What looked like solid frozen battlefield was actually terrain with fatal flaws invisible to outsiders. The Russian prince had grown up on these waters. He'd ice-fished here as a child. He'd nearly drowned here as a teenager when ice gave way beneath him. He knew every weak point, every dangerous channel, every place where the ice was only inches thick despite appearing solid. Those channels would become graves. The Mongols would never see them coming. Impossible, Batu hissed. then louder to his panicking commanders, "Form the caracole! Form the caracole!" The traditional Mongol rotating cavalry tactic that had broken every army from China to Hungary. But forming the caracole from scattered resting groups takes time. Time to organize ranks, time to coordinate movements, time to establish firing sequences, time Alexander wasn't going to give them. At exactly 1 p.m., the wounded prince raised his sword, his bandaged hand barely able to grip the hilt, blood seeping through the leather wrapping, the signal his knights had been praying for. 300 lances dropped to charging position in perfect unison. The sound of wood-striking armor rang across the ice like a death knell. 1 p.m. struck like thunder across frozen water. The Druzhina wedge, 50 elite knights formed into a human spear point, the finest warriors Novgorod could produce, smashed into the hastily forming Mongol center at full gallop. The sound was like the world cracking in half, a crash that peasants in villages 10 miles away later swore they heard. Women in Novgorod claimed the church bells rang themselves at that moment. In those first seconds, 500 Mongol horsemen simply ceased to exist, crushed under the charge, or impaled on Russian lances that were designed specifically to punch through lighter Asian armor. But the real shock wasn't the impact. It was what followed. Instead of wheeling away after the charge, standard cavalry doctrine perfected over centuries, the Druzhina did the unthinkable. They drove deeper, pushing through Mongol ranks like a blade seeking a heart, like an arrow seeking a target. Behind them, Alexander's 250 lesser knights struck in a second wave, exploiting the gap torn by the Druzhina. The charge covered 400 yards in under 90 seconds. 300 armored horsemen moving like an avalanche across ice, like God's own hammer. Their battle cry of "For Rus and Christ" drowning out Mongol commanders' desperate orders in 3 languages. At 600 yards, Mongol arrows began falling like a blizzard, like hail, thousands of arrows darkening the sky. Knights fell, horses screamed and slid on ice, but the charge never wavered. The survivors closed ranks. The wedge maintained its integrity. They came on like doom itself. At 300 yards, the full terror of what was coming became clear to the Mongol front ranks. These weren't just warriors. They were zealots, men who believed death-fighting pagans guaranteed eternal paradise. The Druzhina, especially, with their blood-red cloaks streaming behind them, came on like demons from hell itself, like creatures from nightmare. Mongol veterans who'd never known fear felt it for the first time. 1:15 p.m. brought the first impossible moment. Batu's center, 12,000 of the horde's finest cavalry, warriors who'd conquered 3 empires, began to buckle. Not retreat, buckle, like ice cracking under pressure. The Mongol commanders couldn't believe their eyes. How could 300 exhausted knights be pushing back 40 times their number? The tactics didn't work. The mathematics were impossible. Yet it was happening. Yet they could see it with their own eyes. Then something occurred that no military theorist had predicted, that no chronicle had ever recorded. The Russian horses, bred for ice and snow, born in winter, trained on frozen lakes, maintained their footing perfectly. Their hooves had been specially shod with cleats for ice. Meanwhile, Mongol horses, bred for Asian steppes and deserts, bred for speed and endurance on grass, began slipping. The ice that had seemed so solid became treacherous. Horses lost their footing, crashed into each other, created chaos that no amount of discipline could control. One Druzhina warrior, his lance shattered in the initial impact, used his horse itself as a weapon, guiding the massive animal to crash into Mongol riders, sending them sprawling across the ice. The warrior finally fell after taking 23 arrows, his body so full of shafts he looked like a porcupine, but not before his rampage had broken an entire Mongol squadron. 1:30 p.m. saw panic begin its deadly work. A Mongol tumen on Batu's left wing, seeing the center collapse and horses failing on ice, began pulling back toward shore. In battle, hesitation spreads like plague, like fire through dry grass. Within minutes, the backward movement became a stream. Officers' commands became screams. Formation dissolved into chaos. The impossible was happening before 80,000 witnesses. 80,000 warriors were being disrupted by a force they outnumbered, nearly 300 to 1. But then came Alexander's masterstroke, the tactical genius that would be studied for centuries. His 2,000 infantry, hidden in the tree line during the cavalry charge, suddenly emerged onto the ice from the western shore. They'd been invisible. The Mongols hadn't known they existed. The psychological impact was devastating. To Batu's already rattled forces, it seemed Russian armies were appearing from nowhere, materializing like ghosts. Shouts of "We're surrounded" spread through Mongol ranks. Militarily nonsense, but panic doesn't calculate rationally. Panic doesn't count. Terror multiplies. Alexander himself, barely staying in his saddle, held there by straps and willpower, his wounded face screaming with pain from the cold and exertion, raised his sword again. Blood poured down his neck. His vision was blurring, but his sword rose high. The gesture shouldn't have been possible. His shattered jaw should have made any vigorous movement impossible. Yet every chronicle, Russian and Mongol alike, records it. The prince with half a face was leading from the front, charging with his men, visible to every warrior on both sides. At 100 yards, Mongol horses began rearing, despite their riders' expert control. Animals sensed something their masters couldn't see. The ice beneath them was beginning to crack. The ground literally groaned under the weight of 80,000 warriors trying to maneuver on 3 feet of ice. Fracture lines began appearing, hairline at first, then wider, spreading like lightning across the frozen surface. The noise was indescribable. The crack of breaking ice mixed with war cries in 4 languages, the clash of weapons. Prayers shouted to competing gods, to Allah, to Buddha, to Christ, to ancient spirits. Mongol arrows still darkened the sky, but the Russians came on, unstoppable, inevitable, terrifying, and beneath them all, the ice was beginning to fail. The battlefield itself was breaking apart. 1:45 p.m. marked the moment when battle became catastrophe. As Mongol forces tried to execute their traditional feigned retreat, the tactic that had destroyed countless armies, they discovered Alexander's genius. Those weak spots in the ice that looked like escape routes became death traps. The weight of thousands of horses, all moving in the same direction, all concentrating force on the same points, was exactly the stress the weakened ice couldn't bear. The first section gave way near the southern edge of the battlefield. 200 Mongol warriors simply disappeared into freezing water in seconds. The sound was horrific, a combination of ice shattering and men screaming. Horses thrashed in water so cold it stopped hearts within minutes. Warriors in their light armor sank immediately, dragged down by weapons and equipment. Those who managed to grab ice edges found the edges breaking off in their hands, crumbling like bread. But then at 2 p.m. something happened that even Russian priests called an act of God, that even Muslim imams later admitted was divine judgment. 2 p.m. brought the unthinkable, the moment that would define the battle, that would echo through centuries. Batu's personal guard, 5,000 of the most elite Mongol warriors in existence, men who'd fought from Korea to Hungary, men selected from birth for perfection, tried to execute a flanking maneuver on the Russian right. They charged across a section of ice that looked solid, that had supported armies all morning, that showed no cracks or weaknesses. Underneath, invisible from the surface, warm springs had been weakening the ice for hours. Under the weight of 5,000 charging horses moving at full gallop, the entire section collapsed. The sound was like the earth splitting open, a crack that people in Novgorod, 60 miles away, later claimed they heard. Women swore the sound woke them from sleep. An entire section of Lake Peipus, nearly a quarter-mile across, simply gave way. 5,000 warriors, the pride of the Golden Horde, the best of the best, vanished into water so cold it killed within 3 minutes. Those who didn't drown immediately froze to death, their armor dragging them down into darkness, into cold so intense it stopped thought. The sight shattered what remained of Mongol morale completely and absolutely. If the ice itself was fighting for the Russians, if nature itself rejected the Mongols, what hope did warriors have? Batu himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate, watching his personal guard disappear, made a decision that would haunt him forever. Abandoning his position, abandoning his command, he ordered full retreat. But retreat to where? The ice was failing everywhere. The shore was controlled by Russian infantry. Every direction looked like death. Panic became rout. Rout became massacre. 2:30 p.m. saw pursuit become annihilation, became slaughter on a scale rarely seen in medieval warfare. Russian knights, their blood up, their fear transformed into fury, chased fleeing Mongols across the ice. The killing was methodical, efficient, horrible, mechanical. Those Mongols who made it to shore found Russian infantry waiting with axes and spears. Those who stayed on the ice found it cracking beneath them everywhere they turned. The very battlefield was consuming the invaders. Some Mongols, trapped on ice floes that had broken free, floated helplessly as Russian archers used them for target practice. Others, trying to swim to safety in full armor, froze mid-stroke, becoming ice sculptures of their final desperate moments. The lake was literally eating the horde, swallowing them whole. Modern historians still can't fully explain this part, still debate how it was possible. How did 300 exhausted knights maintain pursuit for hours? How did horses near death from marching find strength to hunt down Mongol cavalry, renowned for their endurance? How did men who'd been collapsing from exhaustion hours earlier now seem superhuman? The Russian chroniclers had an answer. God strengthened them for his purpose. The Mongol chroniclers, horrified and ashamed, agreed that heaven had abandoned the horde that day, that the spirits had turned their faces away. A Persian observer traveling with Batu wrote simply, "I saw the sky weep ice tears for the fallen. I saw hell open on frozen water." 3 p.m. brought scenes that haunt historical records to this day. The pursuit only ended when the ice became too dangerous, even for Russian forces to continue, when the entire lake became a death trap. Alexander himself, fighting through pain that would have killed most men in minutes, had led the charge despite his devastating injuries. Knights later swore they saw his facial bandages completely red with frozen blood, his destroyed eye socket weeping continuously. Yet his voice never wavered, calling orders, directing the slaughter with tactical brilliance born of desperation and intimate knowledge of terrain. By 4 p.m., Mongol dead carpeted the ice for 5 miles in every direction. Bodies floated in the water where ice had given way, creating islands of corpses. Abandoned weapons littered the frozen battlefield like dark stars, like seeds of iron. The streaming banners of the Golden Horde lay trampled in slush made from blood and melted ice. The numbers stagger even now, nearly 800 years later. Of 80,000 warriors who camped confidently the night before, who'd been dividing up Russian lands, fewer than 30,000 saw sunset. 40,000 Mongol dead, another 10,000 captured or missing, presumed drowned. The Russians lost 900 men, heavy losses from just 2,300 engaged, 1/3 of their force, but nothing compared to the Mongol catastrophe. For every Russian who fell, 50 Mongols died. The immediate material gains defied calculation. Batu's army had carried supplies for a campaign of months, gold, weapons, horses, provisions for 80,000 men. In 4 hours, it all became Russian property. The Druzhina alone captured enough Mongol composite bows to equip every archer in Novgorod 3 times over. More importantly, they captured Batu's war chest and the treasury carts meant to collect tribute from conquered lands, literal tons of gold and silver. In one afternoon, the impoverished principality of Novgorod became wealthy beyond its wildest dreams. Alexander, finally allowing himself to be lifted from his horse, collapsed immediately, falling like a dead man. Warriors rushed to support their prince, but he waved them away weakly, insisting on one final act before he lost consciousness. There on that blood-stained ice, surrounded by 40,000 corpses and the groans of the dying, the wounded prince led his exhausted army in prayer. Gospodi pomilui, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. His voice barely a whisper, the sight of 300 blood-soaked warriors kneeling on ice, while surrounded by history's greatest slaughter, struck even hardened veterans as surreal, as something from religious visions. Batu Khan's humiliation was complete and absolute. The man who'd never known defeat, whose name had made emperors tremble, arrived back in Sarai with barely 30,000 survivors. His racing retreat had saved his life, but destroyed his reputation forever. Grandsons of Genghis Khan don't flee from inferior forces. The shame was unbearable. Warriors began deserting. Allies questioned their oaths. As the sun set on that frozen battlefield, painting the ice red and gold, the impossible had become history. The strategic implications were staggering. Batu's power base in Egypt nearly collapsed from the defeat. Syria questioned their allegiance. The careful control the Mongols had established over Eastern Europe cracked in a single afternoon. Military historians calculate it took the Golden Horde 15 years to rebuild credibility comparable to what Batu lost in 4 hours. The Russian states, granted this miraculous reprieve, gained time they'd never dared hope for. Time to rebuild. Time to organize resistance. Time to prove that the Mongol conquest could be stopped, that the Horde was not invincible after all. His destroyed eye socket was badly infected. Fever ravaged him, yet somehow, impossibly, the prince endured. When asked how he'd found strength to fight, Alexander whispered through broken teeth, "Pain is temporary. The horde would have been forever." For 20 years after that frozen April day, the Mongols approached Russian territories with newfound respect, with caution they'd never shown before. Batu Khan, though he never admitted defeat publicly, never again personally led campaigns against Novgorod. The man who'd made Europe tremble had learned that numbers alone don't guarantee victory, not when facing an enemy fighting for their very existence, not when the land itself becomes a weapon. The material windfall from captured supplies funded Russian defenses for 2 decades. New fortifications rose across the principality. Old ones were reinforced with stone. The military Druzhinina recruited aggressively, their ranks swelling with men inspired by Lake Peipus's impossible victory. Young men lined up by the hundreds to join, each wanting to be part of the legend. Alexander Nevsky continued his impossible life for 21 more years, each one a defiance of medical reality, each sunrise a miracle. The prince who should have died from his German wounds, who certainly should have died from his exertions at Lake Peipus, commanded respect from enemies who'd outnumbered him 267 to 1. His shattered face became legendary across Europe and Asia. Children grew up hearing stories of the prince with one eye who'd made the Mongols flee. Mothers told the tale to inspire courage. Priests used it in sermons. When he finally died in 1263 at age 42, even Mongol chroniclers noted his passing with respect. The Persian observer who'd witnessed the battle wrote, "A warrior who could defeat the horde deserved to die in bed, which is itself a form of victory. No blade taken in battle could match what illness finally accomplished." The tragic irony strikes hard even now. Just 15 years after Alexander's death, the Mongols reasserted control over Russian territories through diplomacy, tribute, and selective violence. Without Nevsky's inspired leadership, without his tactical genius and iron will, the principalities crumbled into infighting. The unity forged on ice melted away like spring snow. Russia would remain under Mongol influence for another 200 years, paying tribute, sending hostages, bowing to the Golden Horde. But the lesson of Lake Peipus remained, burning bright in Russian memory. The Golden Horde could be beaten. That knowledge, that tiny flame of hope, survived through centuries of occupation. When Moscow finally rose to throw off the Mongol yoke in the 15th century, historians pointed to Lake Peipus as proof that Russian courage could overcome Asian tyranny. The battle became a founding myth of Russian national identity. Modern military academies still study the Battle of Lake Peipus as the ultimate example of terrain warfare. Alexander understood something Batu missed. Ice is both battlefield and weapon.